The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. The Grotto. It happened on the day of Steerpike's second daylight visit to the library. He was on his return journey and had reached the edge of the pine woods and was awaiting an opportunity to run unobserved across the open ground when, away to his left, he saw a figure moving in the direction of Gormenghast Mountain. The invigorating air, coupled with his recognition of the distant figure, prompted him to change his course, and with quick, bird-like steps he moved rapidly along the edge of the wood. In the rough landscape away to his left, the tiny figure in its crimson dress sang out against the sombre background like a ruby on a slate. The midsummer sun, and how much less this autumn light, had no power to mitigate the dreary character of the region that surrounded Gormenghast. It was like a continuation of the castle, rough and shadowy, and though vast and often windswept, oppressive too, with a kind of raw weight. Ahead lay Gormenghast Mountain in all its permanence, a sinister thing, as though drawn out of the earth by sorcery as a curse on all who viewed it. Although its base appeared to struggle from the blanket of trees within a few miles of the castle, it was in reality a day's journey on horseback. Clouds were generally to be seen clustering about its summit even on the finest days when the sky was elsewhere empty, and it was common to see the storms raging across its heights and the sheets of dark rain slanting mistily over the blurred crown and obscuring half the mountain's hideous body, while at the same time sunlight was playing across the landscape all about it and even on its lower slopes. Today, however, not even a single cloud hung above the peak, and when Fuchsia had looked out of her bedroom window after her midnight meal, she had stared at the mountain and said, "Where are the clouds?" "What clouds?" said the old nurse, who was standing behind her, rocking Titus in her arms. "What is it, my caution?" "There's nearly always clouds on top of the mountain," said Fuchsia. "Aren't there any, dear?" "No," said Fuchsia. "Why aren't there?" Fuchsia realized that Mrs. Slagg knew virtually nothing, but the long custom of asking her questions was a hard one to break down. The realization that grown-ups did not necessarily know any more than children was something against which she had fought. She wanted Mrs. Slagg to remain the wise recipient of all her troubles and the comforter that she had always seemed, but Fuchsia was growing up, and she was now realizing how weak and ineffectual was her old guardian. Not that she was losing her loyalty or affection. She would have defended the wrinkled midget to her last breath if necessary, but she was isolated within herself with no one to whom she could run with that unquestioning confidence, that outpouring of her newest enthusiasms, her sudden terrors, her projects, her stories. "I think I'll go out," she said, "for a walk." "Again?" said Mrs. Slagg, stopping for a moment the rocking of her arms. "You go out such a lot now, don't you? Why are you always going away from me?" "It's not from you," said Fuchsia. "It's because I want to walk and think." "It isn't going away from you. You know it isn't." "I don't know anything," said Nanny Slagg, her face puckered up. "But I know you never went out all the summer, did you, dear? And now that it is so tempersome and cold, you are always going out into the nastiness and getting wet or frozen every day. Oh, my poor heart! Why? Why every day?" Fuchsia pushed her hands into the depths of her big pockets of her red dress. It was true she had deserted her attic for the dreary moors and the rocky tracts of country about Gormenghast. Why was this? Had she suddenly outgrown her attic that had once been all in all to her? Oh no, she had not outgrown it, but something had changed ever since that dreadful night when she saw Steerpike lying by the window in the darkness. It was no longer inviolate, secret, mysterious. It was no longer another world, but part of the castle. Its magnetism had weakened, its silent, shadowy drama had died, and she could no longer bear to revisit it. When last she had ventured up the spiral stairs and entered the musty and familiar atmosphere, Fuchsia had experienced a pang of such sharp nostalgia for what it had once been to her that she had turned from the swaying motes that filled the air and the shadowy shapes of all that she had known as her friends, the cobwebbed organ, the crazy avenue of 100 loves, turned away and tumbled down the dark staircase with a sense of such desolation as seemed would never lift. Her eyes grew dim as she remembered these things, her hands clenched in her deep pockets. "Yes," she said, "I have been out a lot. Do you get lonely? If you do, you needn't, because you know I love you, don't you? You know that, don't you?" She thrust her lower lip forward and frowned at Mrs. Slagg, but this was only to keep her tears back, for nowadays Fuchsia had so lonely a feeling that tears were never far distant. Never having had either positive cruelty or kindness shown to her by her parents, but only an indifference, she was not conscious of what it was that she missed: affection. It had always been so, and she had compensated herself by weaving stories of her own future, or by lavishing her own love upon such things as the objects in her attics, or, more recently, upon what she found or saw among the woods and wastelands. "You do know that, don't you?" Fuchsia repeated. Nanny rocked Titus more vigorously than was necessary, and by the pursing of her lips indicated that his lordship was asleep and that she was speaking too loudly. Then Fuchsia came up to her old nurse and stared at her brother. The feeling of aversion for him had disappeared, and though as yet the lilac-eyed creature had not affected her with any sensation of sisterly love, nevertheless she had got used to his presence in the castle, and would sometimes play with him solemnly for half an hour or so at a time. Nanny's eyes followed Fuchsia's. "Ah, his little lordship," she said, wagging her head. "It's his little lordship. Why do you love him?" "Why do I love him? Oh, my poor weak heart. Why do I love him, stupid? How could you say such a thing?" cried Nanny Slagg. "Oh, my little lordship thing. How could I help it? The innocent notion that he is. Oh, the very next of Gormenghast. Aren't you my only? The very next of all. What did your cruel sister say then? What did she say?" "He must go to his cot now, for his sleep he must, and to dream his golden dreams." "Did you talk to me like that when I was a baby?" asked Fuchsia. "Of course I did," said Mrs. Slagg. "Don't be silly. Oh, the ignorance of you. Are you going to tidy your room for me now, She hobbled to the door with her precious bundle. Every day she asked this same question, but never waited for an answer, knowing that whatever it was she who would have to make some sort of order out of the chaos. Fuchsia again turned to the window and stared at the mountain, whose shape down to the least outcrop had long since scored its outline in her mind. Between the castle and Gormenghast Mountain the land was desolate, for the main part empty wasteland, with large areas of swamp where undisturbed among the reedy tracts the waders moved. Curlews and peewits sent their thin cries along the wind. Moorhens reared their young and paddled blackly in and out of the rushes. To the east of Gormenghast Mountain, but detached from the trees at its base, spread the undulating darkness of the twisted woods. To the west, the unkempt acres, broken here and there with low stunted trees bent by the winds into the shape of hunchbacks. Between this dreary province and the pinewood that surrounded the west wing of the castle, a dark, shelving plateau rose to a height of about 100 to 200 feet, an irregular tableland of greeny black rock, broken and scarred and empty. It was beyond these cold escarpments that the river wound its way about the base of the mountain and fed the swamps where the wild fowl lived. Fuchsia could see 3 short stretches of the river from her window. This afternoon the central portion and that to its right were black with the reflection of the mountain, and the third, away to the west beyond the rocky plateau, was a shadowy white strip that neither glanced nor sparkled, but, mirroring the opaque sky, lay lifeless and inert, like a dead arm. Fuchsia left the window abruptly, and closing the door after her with a crash, ran all the way down the stairs, almost falling as she slipped clumsily on the last flight, before threading a maze of corridors to emerge panting in the chilly sunlight. Breathing in the sharp air, she gulped and clenched her hands together until her nails bit at her palms. Then she began to walk. She had been walking for over an hour when she heard footsteps behind her and, turning, saw Steerpike. She had not seen him since the night at the prune squalors, and never as clearly as now as he approached her through the naked autumn. He stopped when he noticed that he was observed and called, "Lady Fuchsia, may I join you?" Behind him she saw something which, by contrast with the alien, incalculable figure before her, was close and real. It was something which she understood, something which she could never do without, or be without, for it seemed as though it were her own self, her own body, at which she gazed, and which lay so intimately upon the skyline. Gormenghast, the long, notched outline of her home. It was now his background. It was a screen of walls and towers pocked with windows. He stood against it, an intruder, imposing himself so vividly, so solidly against her world, his head overtopping the loftiest of its towers. "What do you want?" she said. A breeze had lifted from beyond the twisted woods, and her dress was blown across her so that down her right side it clung to her, showing the strength of her young body and thighs. "Lady Fuchsia!" shouted Steerpike across the strengthening wind. "I'll tell you!" He took a few quick paces towards her and reached the sloping rock on which she stood. "I want you to explain this region to me, the marshes and Gormenghast Mountain. Nobody has ever told me about it. You know the country. You understand it." He filled his lungs again. "And, though I love the district, I'm very ignorant." He had almost reached her. "Can I share your walks occasionally? Would you consider the idea? Oh, are you returning?" Fuchsia had moved away. "If so, may I accompany you back?" "That's not what you've come to ask me," said Fuchsia slowly. She was beginning to shake in the cold wind. "Yes, it is," said Steerpike. "It is just what I've come to ask you. And whether you will tell me about nature." "I don't know anything about nature," said Fuchsia, beginning to walk down the sloping rock. "I don't understand it. I only look at it. Who told you I knew about it? Who makes up these things?" "No one," said Steerpike. "I thought you must know and understand what you love so much. I have seen you very often returning to the castle laden with the things you have discovered. And also, you look as though you understand." "I do?" said Fuchsia, surprised. "No, I can't do. I don't understand wise things at all." "Your knowledge is intuitive," said the youth. "You have no need of book learning and such like. You only have to gaze at a thing to know it. The wind is getting stronger, your ladyship, and colder. We had better return." Steerpike turned up his high collar, and gaining her permission to accompany her back to the castle, he began with her the descent of the grey rocks. Before they were halfway down, the rain was falling, and the autumn sunlight had given way to a vast, tattered sky. "Tread carefully, Lady Fuchsia," said Steerpike suddenly, and Fuchsia stopped and stared quickly over her shoulder at him as though she had forgotten he was there. She opened her mouth as though to speak, when a far rattle of thunder reverberated among the rocks, and she turned her head to the sky. A black cloud was approaching, and from its pendulous body the rain fell in a mass of darkness. Soon it would be above them, and Fuchsia's thoughts leapt backwards through the years to a certain afternoon when, as today, she had been caught in a sudden rainstorm. She had been with her mother on one of those rare occasions, still rarer now, when the Countess, for some reason or other, decided to take her daughter for a walk. Those occasional outings had been silent affairs, and Fuchsia could remember how she had longed to be free of the presence that moved at her side and above her, and yet she recalled how she had envied her huge mother when the wild birds came to her at her long, shrill, sweet whistle and settled upon her head and arms and shoulders. But what she chiefly remembered was how, on that day, when the storm broke above them, her mother, instead of turning back to the castle, continued onwards towards these same layers of dark rock which she and Steerpike were now descending. Her mother had turned down a rough, narrow gully and had disappeared behind a high slab of dislodged stone that was leaning against a face of rock. Fuchsia had followed, but instead of finding her mother sheltering from the downpour against the cliff and behind the slab, to her surprise, she found herself confronted with the entrance to a grotto. She had peered inside, and there, deep in its chilly throat, was her mother sitting upon the ground and leaning against the sloping wall, very still and silent and enormous. They had waited there until the storm had tired of its own anger and a slow rain descended like remorse from the sky. No word had passed between them, and Fuchsia, as she remembered the grotto, felt a shiver run through her body. But she turned to Steerpike. "Follow me, if you want to," she said. "I know a cave." The rain was by now thronging across the escarpment, and she began to run over the slippery grey rock surfaces with Steerpike at her heels. As she began the short, steep descent, she turned for an instant to see whether Steerpike had kept pace with her, and as she turned, her feet slipped away from under her on the slithery surface of an opaque slab, and she came crashing to the ground, striking the side of her face, her shoulders, and shin with a force that for a moment stunned her, but only for a moment. As she made an effort to rise and felt the pain growing at her cheekbone, Steerpike was beside her. He had been some 12 yards away as she fell, but he slithered like a snake among the rocks and was kneeling beside her almost immediately. He saw at once that the wound upon her face was superficial. He felt her shoulder and shin bone with his thin fingers and found them sound. He removed his cape, covered her, and glanced down the gully. The rain swam over his face and thrashing on the rocks. At the base of the steep decline, he could see, looming vaguely through the downpour, a huge propped rock, and he guessed that it was towards this that Fuchsia had been running, for the gully ended within 40 feet in a high, unscalable wall of granite. Fuchsia was trying to sit up, but the pain in her shoulder had drained her of strength. "Lie still!" shouted Steerpike through the screen of rain that divided them. Then he pointed to the propped rock. "Is that where we were going?" he asked. "There's a cave behind it," she whispered. "Help me up. I can get there all right." "Oh no," said Steerpike. He knelt down beside her, and then with great care he lifted her inch by inch from the rocks. His wiry muscles toughened in his slim arms and along his spine, as by degrees he raised her to the level of his chest, getting to his feet as he did so. Then, step by tentative step over the splashing boulders, he approached the cave. 100 rain-thrashed pools had collected among the rocks. Fuchsia had made no remonstrance, knowing that she could never have made this difficult descent, but as she felt his arms around her and the proximity of his body, something deep within her tried to hide itself. Through the thick, tousled strands of her drenched hair she could see his sharp, pale, crafty face, his powerful dark red eyes focused upon the rocks below them, his high protruding forehead, his cheekbones glistening, his mouth an emotionless line. This was Steerpike. He was holding her. She was in his arms, in his power. His hard arms and fingers were taking the weight at her thighs and shoulders. She could feel his muscles like bars of metal. This was the figure whom she had found in her attic, and who had climbed up the sheer and enormous wall. He had said that he had found a stone skyfield. He had said that she understood nature. He wanted to learn from her. How could he, with his wonderful long sentences, learn anything from her? She must be careful. He was clever. But there was nothing wrong with being clever. Dr. Prune was clever, and she liked him. She wished she was clever herself. He was edging between the wall of rock and the slanting slab, and suddenly they were in the dim light of the grotto. The floor was dry, and the thunder of the rain beyond the entrance seemed to come from another world. Steerpike lowered her carefully to the ground and propped her against a flat, slanting portion of the wall. Then he pulled off his shirt and began, after wringing as much moisture from it as he could, to tear it into long, narrow pieces. She watched him, fascinated in spite of the pain she was suffering. It was like watching someone from another world who was worked by another kind of machinery, by something smoother, colder, harder, swifter. Her heart rebelled against the bloodlessness of his precision, but she had begun to watch him with a grudging admiration for a quality so alien to her own temperament. The grotto was about 15 feet in depth, the roof dripping to the earth, so that in only the first 9 feet from the entrance was it possible to stand upright. Close to the arching roof, areas of the rock face were broken and fretted into dim convulsions of stone, and a fanciful eye could, with a little difficulty, beguile any length of time by finding among the interwoven patterns an inexhaustible army of ghoulish or seraphic heads, according to the temper of the moment. The recesses of the grotto were in deep darkness, but it was easy enough for Fuchsia and Steerpike to see each other in the dull light near the shielded entrance. Steerpike had torn his shirt into neat strips and had knelt down beside Fuchsia and bandaged her head and staunched the bleeding, which, especially from her legs, where the injury was not so deep, was difficult to check. Her upper arm was less easy, and it was necessary for her to allow Steerpike to bare her shoulder before he could wash it clean. She watched him as he carefully dabbed the wound. The sudden pain and shock had changed to a raw aching, and she bit her lip to stop her tears. In the half-light she saw his eyes smouldering in the shadowy whiteness of his face. Above the waist he was naked. What was it that made his shoulders look deformed? They were high, but were sound, though like the rest of his body, strangely taut and contracted. His chest was narrow and firm. He removed the swab of cloth from her shoulder slowly and peered to see whether the blood would continue to flow. "Keep still," he said. "Keep your arm as still as you can. How's the pain?" "I'm all right," said Fuchsia. "Don't be heroic," he said, sitting back on his heels. "We're not playing a game. I want to know exactly how much you're in pain, not whether you are brave or not. I know that already. Which hurts you most?" "My leg," said Fuchsia. "It makes me want to be ill. And I'm cold. Now you know." Their eyes met in the half-light. Steerpike straightened himself. "I'm going to leave you," he said. "Otherwise the cold will gnaw you to bits. I can't get you back to the castle alone. I'll fetch the prune and a stretcher. You'll be all right here. I'll go now at once. We'll be back within half an hour. I can move when I want to." "Steerpike," said Fuchsia. He knelt down at once. "What is it?" he said, speaking very softly. "You've done quite a lot to help," she said. "Nothing much," he replied. His hand was close to hers. The silence which followed became ludicrous, and he got to his feet. "Mustn't stay." He had sensed the beginning of something less frigid. He would leave things as they were. You'll be shaking like a leaf if I don't hurry. Keep absolutely still." He laid his coat over her and then walked the few paces to the opening. Fuchsia watched his hunched yet slender outline as he stood for a moment before plunging into the rain-swept gully. Then he had gone, and she remained quite still, as he had told her, and listened to the pounding of the rain. Steerpike's boast as to his fleetness was not an idle one. With incredible agility he leapt from boulder to boulder until he had reached the head of a gully, and from there, down the long slopes of the escarpment, he sped like a dervish. But he was not reckless. Every one of his steps was a calculated result of a decision taken at a swifter speed than his feet could travel. At length the rocks were left behind, and the castle emerged through a dull blanket. His entrance into the prune squalors was dramatic. Irma, who had never before seen any male's skin other than that which protrudes beyond the collar and the cuffs, gave a piercing cry and fell into her brother's arms, only to recover at once and dash from the room in a typhoon of black silk. Prunesqualler and Steerpike could hear the stair rods rattling as she whirled her way up the staircase, and the crashing of her bedroom door set the pictures swaying on the walls of all the downstairs rooms. Dr. Prunesqualler had circled around Steerpike with his head drawn back so that his cervical vertebrae rested against the rear wall of his high collar, and a plumbless abysm yawned between his Adam's apple and his pearl stud. With his head bridled backwards thus, somewhat in the position of a cobra about to strike, and with his eyebrows raised quizzically, he was yet able at the same time to flash both tiers of his startling teeth, which caught and reflected the lamplight with an unnatural brilliancy. He was in an ecstasy of astonishment. The spectacle of a half-nude, dripping Steerpike both repelled and delighted him. Every now and then Steerpike and the doctor could hear an extraordinary moaning from the floor above. When, however, the doctor heard the cause of the boy's appearance, he was at once on the move. It had not taken Steerpike long to explain what had happened. Within a few moments the doctor had packed up a small bag and rung for the cook to fetch both a stretcher and a couple of young men as bearers. Meanwhile, Steerpike had dived into another suit and run across to Mrs. Slagg in the castle, whom he instructed to replenish the fire and to have Fuchsia's bed ready and some hot drink brewing, leaving her in a state of querulous collapse, which was not remedied by his tickling her rudely in the ribs as he skipped past her to the door. Coming into the quadrangle, he caught sight of the doctor as he was emerging from his garden gate with the two men and the stretcher. Prunesqualler was holding his umbrella over a bundle of rugs under which he had placed his medical bag. When he had caught them up, he gave them their directions, saying that he would run on ahead, but would reappear on the escarpment to direct them in the final stage of their journey. Tucking one of the blankets under his cape, he disappeared into the thinning rain. As he ran on alone, he made jumps into the air. Life was amusing, so amusing. Even the rain had played into his hand and made the rock slippery. Everything, he thought to himself, can be of use. Everything. And he clicked his fingers as he ran grinning through the rain. When Fuchsia woke in her bed and saw the firelight flickering on the ceiling and Nanny Slagg sitting beside her, she said, "Where is Steerpike?" "Who, my precious? Oh, my poor pretty one." And Mrs. Slagg fidgeted with Fuchsia's hand, which she had been holding for over an hour. "What is it you need, my only? What is it, my caution, dear? Oh, my poor heart, you nearly killed me, dear, very nearly, yes, very nearly then. There, stay still, and the doctor will be here again soon. Oh, my poor weak heart." The tears were streaming down her little, old, terrified face. "Nanny," said Fuchsia, "where's Steerpike?" "That horrid boy?" asked Nanny. "What about him, precious? You don't want to see him, do you? Oh, no, you couldn't want that boy. What is it, my only? Do you want to see him?" "Oh, no, said Fuchsia. "I don't want to. I feel so tired. Are you there? What is it, my only?" "Nothing. I wonder where he is."